I would have lasted 18 months at that TV network. He's been there 35 years. Neither of us is wrong, but most people never figure out which one they are.
This is Winning at Work, a podcast about how to think better, make better decisions, and build a career that actually works.
I want to talk today about my friend Franklin. I met Franklin 25 or more years ago when we were both playing on the Warner Brothers softball team in the Entertainment League in LA. Franklin was a guy from New York, good softball player, loved sports, loved music, so we had a ton in common. We'd spend time in the dugout or sometimes in the bar afterwards, chatting about life, about music, sports, you name it. And I was always struck with how different we were as people, but how much I authentically liked him. He's a good guy. You could just tell his heart and his head were both in the right place. But he was calm, measured guy. You could tell he was sort of always kind of sussing everything and probably, frankly, a move or two ahead of some of us at the time. Meanwhile, I'm, the class clown, chaotic energy, just sort of very, very different vibe. And that's something that really struck me about that. So Franklin was, he has been now, he's been 35 years at one of the biggest television networks, the one you're thinking about. Yeah, that one. And he survived it. And it's a turbulent place to work. There's been articles and tons of stuff written about it. There's been movies made with big stars about the goings on there. But he's thrived in a very, very chaotic sort of scenario, but also very controlled. Meanwhile, I would walk in when I was in band management. I would walk in to my office every single day having absolutely zero idea what was going to happen. And I love that. Would the band get $1 million offer that day, or would the singer get arrested? Like, it was often that binary. And that gig took years off the end of my life. But I also absolutely loved that I would walk into that office every day having absolutely no idea what was going to happen. Meanwhile, Franklin just grinding it out. And I recently went to a hockey game with him and we caught up, and he said some things about how to survive inside an organization that large for that long. And I think that's really what I'd like to talk about today is what does it actually take to survive that long inside a machine that big? So 35 years in any organization is remarkable, but at a place like the place Frank has worked, it's almost mythological. I mean, most people can't last 5 years in a turbulent org. I wouldn't last 5 minutes. And Franklin has lasted 35. And it's not because he's lucky. He doesn't make himself invisible. And he's not just riding it out. He's involved. But he figured out something that most people never do. And I just asked him direct at the game. I was like, what do you think is your secret? And he had two answers that really surprised me. The first was, don't be above any task. Now, Frank is really senior in that organization. In fact, he reports to a guy who reports to the guy, the effective owner. And he just felt like there was any time anything had to get done, if it absolutely had to get done, no job is beneath you. Now, he mentioned, I thought this was interesting, there's a downside of that, which is sometimes you wind up covering weaker staff because you do something that they couldn't. But this isn't about being a pushover. It's about being the person who makes things happen regardless. And in a big organization, the people who aren't always the most brilliant, but they're the most reliable, tend to thrive. And that's where I've been really diving deep into some research lately. And that's where the long survivors tend to be the ones who orient themselves around contribution and not status. And I get that, but I just know it wasn't for me. Even back then in my 20s, I knew it wasn't for me. Like, I had a friend, Rick, who's a fireman. And I remember he told me one day, he said, you can give me any date 5 years from now, and I can tell you if I'm working that day or not. And I thought, that sounds like the seventh ring of hell to me. Now, I admire that in a sense because I admire the sort of rhythm of it all and you can prioritize your non-work life in a way that you can't when you're in a more chaotic sort of entrepreneurial setting. So if 5 years from now, Tuesday the 13th, let's say, you're gonna work from, noon to midnight or midnight to midnight is fireman, so I think he does 12-hour shifts. You can commit to doing something at 6 PM the next night because you're gonna be off and you're gonna be free and you don't take work with you. I am probably the worst example of taking work with you. That's something I've struggled with and I continue to struggle with this day. But the downside, Franklin himself flagged a couple things there. First of all, you hide the weak performers. Second of all, people start to depend on you, and I've talked about this before as sort of the mule, and so you have to be very careful in riding that line. But I think there's a difference between being willing to do any task and being the person everyone dumps on. And Franklin knew the difference. Not everybody does. But Franklin's second key is the one that really, really made me think, and it's something I never considered, and it made a ton of sense. At some point, after enough years, your organization, your institutional knowledge, you become the wise uncle, not about the industry, but about the organization itself. And that makes you incredibly valuable to people above you, by the way, as well as people beneath you. In fact, I would argue it makes you more valuable to the people above you who haven't been there 35 years. Maybe they've been there 35 days and they need someone as a straight shooter who can come in and say, hey, here's how this really works at this organization. And that can save you so much time and heartache. Same thing for the folks that report to you, the folks that are on your level. As long as you feel like their actions are pure and they're trying to do the right thing, you can help them a ton. Knowing how things actually work, not the organization chart, but knowing how things really work in reality is super, super valuable. Who makes the decisions? Where are the bodies buried? Which battles are worth fighting? And more importantly, which ones are not? And that's where sort of the wise uncle framing comes into it. Leaders come and go, strategies change, reorgs happen. I was at a gambling company where I think I've said this before, the reorg, we were not done with one and the next one was starting. It was absolutely ridiculous. But the person who knows where everything is and how everything really runs and the people who make very specific things run and who to call in that specific situation really becomes almost indispensable just by their presence. And, I thought about that as well with Charlie. I referenced a guy called Charlie in an earlier episode called Charlie and the Influence Factory. Listen to it if you haven't. It's not unlike that, except Franklin used his organizational knowledge and his political sort of cleverness with integrity. I'm not sure, as you'll hear in the episode, that Charlie always used it with integrity. And one of the sort of flaws in my game is I've never stayed anywhere long enough to accumulate this organization knowledge. I've never had a company. I've always had to build everything from scratch. I've had to start over. And some would say that's a superpower in some ways, but it's also annoying as hell because you don't always necessarily get to capitalize on the momentum you've had prior in order to build on what you're trying to build because you either sell the business or the business doesn't work or you leave the business or you go do something else. Franklin was never like that. He was always there, always available. And I think I really, really found a deep respect for that. And this led me to do a lot of research. And I think it's really interesting. And again, some of the things that I really didn't expect. Some of the things that people say that have translated into really long careers is adaptability. So Franklin certainly he survived multiple regime changes just above him. The very top didn't change until recently-ish, but he survived multiple leadership regimes above him. Tons of his entire industry got disrupted because of the internet, and he always adapted. He bent without breaking. I think that was really, really key. And listen, just like what Charlie didn't do, right? Charlie from the earlier episode, Charlie was great at managing upward, didn't really care about anything else. But Franklin maintained relationships across all levels. He learned how to manage his time such that he could keep his bosses informed and happy. He could keep his colleagues moving forward, and he could mentor and help the folks that worked for him. He was never just playing in one direction. And this is one that Franklin talked about and that I really didn't consider. I thought it was very, very interesting. I'm going to bring it back to him, but my research kind of brought it here too. Separate your identity from the job. And if you think about it, you would think that someone that survived that long would not be able to do that. It was just all about the job. But Franklin knew who he was outside the building. He's an amateur musician. He loved music. He loved sports. Very rarely would you see Franklin if you met him out somewhere and he wouldn't be wearing some form of paraphernalia by one of his teams. But he wasn't defined by his job. He actually didn't talk about it a whole lot. But he just happened to be very, very good at it for a long time. I just teased him at the hockey game. I said, "You're like Pete Rose." Pete Rose was not the greatest baseball player ever, but he was a good baseball player for an incredibly long time, and he just survived. And I think also one of the things that separated Franklin that tends to come up in this research over and over again is having that political intelligence, but again, without losing ethics. I think this is what separates Franklin, frankly, from Charlie. Charlie always rode the line, and everyone had an eye on him, and it made him a target, actually. But Franklin always stayed on the right side of it. And that's actually harder and rarer than it sounds. It also builds respect. I mean, I respected Charlie, but I respected Charlie's game, not the human. I respect Franklin, and I genuinely like him and value his company and his time. And so when we sat in that dugout so long ago, I knew we were different people. I knew Franklin valued rhythm, stability, routine, and he built his whole career around mastering a very specific environment. I don't know that I wanted chaos. In fact, I would say that I didn't, but I absolutely did love the unpredictability. And I think that's why I've landed in industries that have accommodated that unpredictability. I'm in the gambling business now. By definition, you cannot predict gambling. It is random, it is chance. And neither of those outlooks is wrong at all, but both of them have costs. And that cost for me, as I've just said, was starting over repeatedly, building from scratch repeatedly, and never accumulating the wise uncle knowledge. Now, I have that wise uncle knowledge on a global sense, and I think actually, in some ways, I probably have a much better library of knowledge and wisdom to call on because I've been in so many different situations. And what you see when you're in so many different situations is you see similarities across industries, across eras. Also helps to be old. And I think that's something that I have called on. And one of the reasons I started this podcast, frankly. Maybe Franklin could have. I remember him being recruited a fair bit in his maybe mid-30s. And maybe I don't know, maybe he regrets some roads not taken. And maybe some mornings where he's going into work felt like routine and the routine felt like a ceiling rather than a floor. I don't know, but sometimes I wonder. But the thing I realize is, and I started with this, I couldn't do what Franklin did. No chance. I joked I would have lasted 5 minutes. I probably would have lasted 18 months. And I know that about myself. And I think there's a lot of value in knowing that, things like that about yourselves. But I think Franklin, as much as he loved rock and roll, I'm not sure he could have done what I did either, because it takes a little bit of a different mindset to be a different type of adaptability, right? So Franklin could adapt to different environments and but the structure was always the same. I would have to adapt. You just have to think. There is no box, right? You talk about thinking outside the box. I hate that expression, by the way. I think really my takeaway here is knowing thyself is incredibly underrated career advice. And Franklin played the long game. And look, he won it on his own terms. He's doing great. He and I, even though he's a little older than me, we're almost in the same thing. That I think his kid is a sophomore in high school. My kid's a junior in high school. So we're both about to be empty nesters. But he played the long game and won it on his own terms. And that's not a small thing. A lot of people, and I think this is one of the things I hope to achieve from this podcast, a lot of people never figure out what game they're actually playing. And hopefully I can get people to think about that and maybe help them directionally with that. But whether you're an entrepreneur, a startup person, or someone inside a big machine, the question is always the same, and I've said this before. Do you know what you're optimizing for? Franklin knew it early, stuck to it, and executed it with integrity for 35 years. Some people win by leaving. Franklin won by staying. They both take courage, but only one of them takes patience. And that might be the harder one. If you want the deeper version of these ideas, I write a newsletter called Winning at Work. You can find it in the show notes.
Follow Winning at Work on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen, and find us at winningatwork.io and across all socials.